At my wedding in Boston, my sister Natalie lifted a glass of red wine, locked eyes with me, and smirked. Here's to the family fraud in white. The liquid hit me before I could even process the words. Dark crimson soaking through the lace, dripping down to my shoes. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone laughed, thinking it was a joke, until they saw my face. My mom rushed toward her, grabbing her arm. She didn't mean it. She whispered to me as if that could erase the sting or the stain. I didn't reply. I just stood there, frozen in my own wedding dress, my hands shaking around the bouquet. That night, I logged into the shared bank account, the one I'd been funding for months, and froze every cent by 8. The next morning, Natalie got the real wedding gift from me. Her university had withdrawn her enrollment. Everything about that morning had felt like it belonged in a dream. The air in Boston was crisp, but warm enough that the glass panels of the Botanical Conservatory let in a golden filtered light. Rows of white orchids lined the aisle. The scent of fresh eucalyptus wrapped around me as I stood beside Jason, listening to the hum of quiet conversations, the clinking of champagne flutes. It wasn't just polite happiness radiating from our guests. It was genuine joy, the kind that comes when people have watched you fight for something and finally win. Jason's eyes never left mine. Every time he smiled, I felt like my heart could burst through the delicate lace of my dress. The ceremony had gone flawlessly. No forgotten vows, no awkward pauses, just perfection. We moved into the reception, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is the day I'll want to replay in my head when I'm old. And then the doors opened. Natalie walked in, late, loud, wrapped, head to toe in white. Not ivory, not cream, not some technically acceptable shade like pearl. Wedding white satin-fitted bodice, dramatic train, sparkling crystal belt that caught the light like it was desperate to be seen. She didn't care. She never does. I watched the air shift. It was subtle, but I felt it. Conversation softened. The music seemed to falter for just a beat. A few guests turned to each other, their eyebrows raised and silent. Is this for real? One man I barely knew actually laughed, glancing between us as if this were some kind of elaborate joke. It wasn't. Natalie strutted in like the reception was hers, like we'd all been waiting for her grand entrance. She didn't say anything right away. She didn't need to. Her presence was loud enough. Jason's grip on my hand tightened. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on me as if willing me to stay rooted in this moment we had worked so hard for. But my jaw had already tightened my stomach, twisting in that familiar way it always did when Natalie decided to make herself the center of the universe. Even then, part of me hoped she'd just sit down, eat dinner, smile for the cameras, pretend to be gracious for one night. But Natalie doesn't do gracious. She does disruption. From the moment Natalie sat down front row, of course, I could feel the energy changing. Not in a dramatic crash and burn way. Not yet. It was quieter than that. More like a hairline crack running through glass. You can't hear it at first, but you know it's there, spreading. She leaned over to speak to one of my cousins, and they both laughed too loud, too sharp at a moment when everyone else was still settling into the meal. A few heads turned. Jason squeezed my hand under the table, his silent way of saying, "Let it go." I tried. I smiled at guests, thanked them for coming, posed for photos, even though I could feel Natalie's eyes on me like a camera lens trained on prey. Every time I caught her gaze, she didn't look away. She just smiled, slow and knowing. It wasn't the first time she'd pulled something like this. When we were teenagers, she wore white to my high school graduation party. It's just a dress she'd said as though I was the crazy one for noticing. When I got my first real job, she accidentally announced her engagement at my celebration dinner. That one fell apart in less than a year, but the point had been made. No moment was safe from her need to take center stage. The thing about Natalie is that she doesn't have to be actively cruel to ruin something. She can do it with the smallest shifts. Interrupting a conversation, pulling focus in a group photo, choosing a seat that forces everyone else to look at her. That night, it was all there in miniature. The tilt of her head when she listened to people talk, the deliberate way she asked the band about their set list, mi dong. the sparkle of her belt catching the lights like it was winking at the crowd. She wasn't being openly hostile. That would have made her easier to deal with. She was weaving herself into the fabric of my wedding in a way that made it impossible to ignore her without looking petty. By the time the salads were cleared, I could feel the strain in my cheeks from smiling. Jason's palm was warm against mine under the table, a quiet anchor. He was working as hard as I was to keep the evening from tipping into chaos. We moved into the first dance. Natalie stood at the edge of the dance floor, arms crossed her train, spilling behind her like she was in her own bridal shoot. She didn't clap when we finished. She didn't smile in the photos. She just lingered. People started to notice. Not everyone, but enough that I caught the subtle glances being passed between tables. A few guests leaned in to whisper something to me. "Everything okay?" And I brushed them off with a laugh. Because if I acknowledged it, if I gave voice to the tension, she'd win. And I wasn't giving her that. Not yet. The evening rolled forward like a play we were all pretending to enjoy. The band played their set. Servers who between tables with plated entree, and I floated from guest to guest, smiling, hugging, thanking, even though every muscle in my face was starting to ache. Natalie was always there, never far, never quiet for long. If she wasn't laughing too loudly, she was leaning into a conversation she wasn't part of. If she wasn't at her table, she was hovering by the bar, making small, deliberate gestures like she was marking her territory. I noticed the way her train trailed dangerously close to people's chairs, forcing them to adjust, drawing their attention. She didn't trip. She never does. She was too controlled for that. This wasn't an accident. It never was. At one point, I caught her in the corner of my eye, head bent toward Jason's cousin, whispering something. The cousin's eyes flicked to me, then quickly away. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. The photographer tried to corral us all for a group shot. Natalie positioned herself right next to me, shoulder brushing mine, her dress catching the same light as mine, so in the frame it would look like there were two brides. She smiled wide for the camera, a picture of charm. I smiled too, because what else could I do? Every toast felt like a balancing act. Friends spoke about love, about resilience, about partnership, and I clung to their words like life rafts. But underneath, I was hyper-aware of where she was, what she was doing, how close she was to tipping this entire night into something I couldn't salvage. Jason was a constant beside me, his hand brushing mine when no one was looking, his smile steady. It helped, but it didn't erase the knot in my stomach. I could feel it tightening with each passing hour. With every small disruption Natalie planted, like a seed that might bloom into chaos. And yet the cruelest part, I kept hoping she'd stop. That maybe she'd remember this was my wedding and that some lines weren't meant to be crossed. I hoped for something she's never given me restraint. It was like walking on glass, every step measured, every word, calculated, every laugh, a little too rehearsed. One wrong move and the whole thing could shatter. By the time the main courses were cleared and the band shifted into a softer, slower set, I thought maybe we'd made it through. Maybe the worst she could do had already been done. But Natalie doesn't need hours to cause damage. She only needs seconds, and she was about to take them. It was near the end of the reception when the room finally began to exhale. The music had softened into a mellow hum. A few guests were lingering at the bar. Others were scattered across the dance floor in small, easy groups. Jason and I had just finished laughing at something. One of his uncles said a real laugh. Not the kind I'd been forcing all night, and for the first time since Natalie walked in, I thought, maybe we've made it. That's when I saw her stand up. She rose slowly, like she wanted to make sure every pair of eyes had time to find her. The light caught the beading on her belt, sending tiny sparks across the room. In her hand, a long-stemmed glass of red wine. I told myself she was going to make a toast. Not a kind one maybe, but something vaguely civil, some thin attempt to smooth over the tension. It would be fake, but I would have accepted it. I would have swallowed it whole just to keep the peace for a few more minutes. She didn't look at me. She looked at Jason, and then loud enough to cut through the low hum of conversation, she said, "Here's to the family fraud in white." It took a second for the words to land. A laugh bubbled from someone near the back, probably thinking it was some weird inside joke. But before anyone could react, before I could react, she tilted the glass and the wine came for me. It hit square in the center of my dress. Warm, sharp, scented liquid soaking through the lace, sliding down the satin, pooling at my waist before dripping onto the floor. My bouquet slipped in my hand. The stain spread like a wound. For a moment, I couldn't hear anything. Not the music, not the murmurs, not even the sharp inhale from the table nearest us. Just the blood pounding in my ears. Then the sounds rushed back. A glass clinking to the floor. A sharp gasp from one of Jason's aunts. The sudden scrape of a chair and my mother's voice slicing through it all. "She didn't mean it," she said, already crossing the floor, her heels clicking against the wood like a countdown. She grabbed Natalie's arm, tugging her back, murmuring something frantic and low. I looked down at the mess on my dress, then up at my mother, then at Natalie. She was smiling, not wide, not theatrical, just the faint, satisfied curve of someone who had gotten exactly what they came for. I didn't say a word. Not to her, not to my mother, not to anyone Jason's hand found mine. His grip was steady, grounding. "You okay?" he murmured. I nodded, though it was a lie. The photographer had frozen mid-step, his camera still hanging from his neck. Guests stared at me, then at her, then back again, as though waiting for me to explode or cry or storm out. I did none of those things. Instead, I walked away out of the reception hall down the short hallway to the bridal suite where my backup dress was hanging, just in case of an accident. I hadn't packed it for this. I'd imagined maybe I'd change later in the night to dance more comfortably, but now it was an escape hatch. In the bathroom, I peeled the ruined gown off my skin, the fabric heavy and cold where the wine had soaked through. I stood there for a moment staring at myself in the mirror in nothing but my slip and felt a wave of exhaustion so deep it hurt. Then I put on the second dress, fixed my hair, painted on a smile so precise it could have been drawn with a ruler. When I walked back out into the reception, I was ready for the rest of the night to look perfect in every photo. I danced. I laughed. I thanked the guests. And all the while, I was already making a decision. That was the last time Natalie would humiliate me. That night, after the last guest had gone, the music had faded, and Jason had fallen asleep beside me. I stayed awake, not angry, not crying, just still. The image of Natalie's smile as the wine hit my dress played over and over in my head like a scene on repeat. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a heat of the moment slip. It was deliberate, and that made my decision just as deliberate. I reached for my phone, opened the banking app, and stared at the shared account, the one I'd been pouring money into for months, money she used for tuition rent emergencies, which usually meant bailing her out of bad decisions. No warning, no text, no chance for her to twist it into something else. I froze it. The next morning at 8:40, the first domino fell. Her university processed the tuition payment late. It bounced. At 8:41, she got the email, enrollment withdrawn. I didn't answer when my mother called. Seconds later, she called again and again. By the fifth attempt, I knew exactly what voicemail I'd hear. A screech of outrage, an accusation, a demand to fix this. I set the phone face down and sipped my coffee. Natalie had been on the edge for a long time, and I'd been the net catching her every time she fell. The thing about being the net is that no one thanks you. They just expect you to be there. Last year, she blew her savings on a multi-level marketing scam her friend swore was a sure thing. I bailed her out. She missed her grant deadline for school. I covered her tuition. She crashed her car and had no insurance. I paid the deposit on her rental. Not once did she say thank you. Not once did she act like she owed me anything. But what she did at my wedding, what she did to me, crossed a line so far I couldn't even see it anymore. So I kept going. By noon, I had logged into the health insurance portal. 2 years ago, I'd added her to my plan temporarily just until she got her own coverage. She'd never paid a dime toward it. That door closed with one click. Next was the student loan portal. I'd set up automatic minimum payments on her behalf when she was struggling to find work. I canceled them. They'd default within a month unless she stepped in. I didn't text her. I didn't post about it. I didn't tell anyone except Jason, who just nodded and said, "Good." I wasn't doing this to embarrass her. That was her game. I was doing this so she'd finally see what her life looked like without me propping it up. And the truth, it didn't even feel like revenge. It felt like correction. By the end of that day, the account was frozen. The insurance was gone. The loan payments were canceled. And Natalie had no idea just how much ground was about to vanish beneath her. She'd thrown wine at me to make a scene. I was dismantling her life in silence. It didn't take long for the calls to start. First, it was my mother. Her voice was sharp, laced with the kind of outrage that pretends to be concern. "She's devastated." "Sienna, you can't just pull the rug out from under her like this. It's cruel." I didn't answer because if I did, the conversation would follow the same tired script. Natalie's feelings first, my boundaries last, then my father called. He was calmer, but his message was the same. "Do you understand what you've done? She can't fix this on her own. The school won't bend the rules just because you're upset." I told him I understood perfectly. That was the point. By the end of the day, the cousins started. Texts from numbers I hadn't seen in years popped up on my phone. "Hey, I know we haven't talked in a while, but all of them carried the same undertone. You're the stable one. We're counting on you to fix this." That line, "you're the stable one," made my teeth clench because being the stable one had never been a compliment in this family. It was a job description. It meant I was the one who swallowed insults, paid bills that weren't mine, kept the peace, no matter the cost. And now they were mad because I'd quit the job. When the direct appeals didn't work, they got creative. One cousin messaged Jason on Facebook, telling him they were worried about me as if cutting off Natalie was a symptom of some deeper instability. He didn't respond. Then they went to my Instagram, liking old posts, leaving little comments about family being everything. The worst was my mother sliding into Jason's DMs. She told him I was punishing Natalie, that this was a red flag, that he should keep an eye out for controlling behavior. He read the message out loud to me while we brushed our teeth. We both laughed, but inside something settled even deeper in me. This wasn't about getting me to forgive Natalie. This was about shaming me into compliance. So I sent one text to my mother. "If she apologizes directly to me, I'll consider talking." There was no reply. Because Natalie doesn't apologize, especially not to other women. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was planning. I could feel them regrouping, figuring out their next move. By day 3, the cousin brigade was back, now armed with nostalgia. "Remember when you two used to build blanket forts? Remember how she looked up to you, as if childhood memories could erase what she'd done to me in front of everyone I loved?" I didn't respond. I wouldn't give them an opening because here's what they didn't understand. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger can fade. What I felt now was resolve. They thought they could guilt me into stepping back into the role they'd written for me years ago. They thought they could make me afraid of being the problem. But I wasn't afraid. Not of their disappointment, not of their silence. And definitely not of what came next. By the end of the week, I knew Natalie hadn't even tried to fix anything. No calls to the university, no scrambling for new housing, no job hunt. She was just waiting because in her mind, I'd cave. I always did. The first time she reached out, it wasn't to apologize. It was a text. "Hey, the rent office at my student housing is being weird. Can you clear it up real quick?" Like I was her personal accountant. I didn't reply. The next day, they're saying I have to move out by Friday. "Seriously, you're going to let that happen?" Yes. Yes, I was. Then she made the mistake of going public. An Instagram post, a picture of her at some wine bar smiling with a glass in hand. The caption, "Some people are great at pretending. Guess I learned from the best." She tagged me. I didn't take the bait, but I didn't ignore it either. There was one more support beam under her life that I'd been holding up without her even realizing how much power it gave me. Her scholarship. It was a competitive program she'd only gotten into because I'd written a letter of recommendation that vouched for her stability, maturity, and dedication. She'd been bragging about it for months, so I emailed the foundation. I didn't have to embellish a thing. I attached the university's official withdrawal notice and wrote, "I can no longer support her participation in this program. The circumstances surrounding her current status do not align with the values I endorsed in my letter." They replied within a day, polite, professional. They thanked me for the information and said they'd review her eligibility. By the next afternoon, she was dropped. My phone rang 3 times in a row. This time I answered. She didn't bother hiding the panic. "You've ruined my future. Do you even get that I had plans, Sienna? Real plans. And now everything is falling apart because you're being petty." I let the silence hang until she snapped. "What will it take? Money, a public post? What, there's nothing you can offer," I said. "You're not serious. This is your sister." "That used to mean something," I replied. And then I hung up. Friday came, and so did her eviction from campus housing. I didn't hear where she went, but a photo arrived from my mother later that weekend. Natalie sitting on a friend's couch, her belongings stuffed into trash bags. I should have felt guilt. I didn't. What I felt was clarity. For years, I'd been holding her life together with duct tape and late-night wire transfers. I'd packed her boxes when she moved to school, labeled every item. I'd kept her bills paid and her deadlines met. And for what? So she could humiliate me on the one day she should have been standing beside me. Proud? No. Those days were over. The scholarship was the final thread, and I just pulled it. A week passed in an uneasy quiet. No calls, no texts, no tagged posts from Natalie. Even my parents seemed to retreat into silence, which almost felt more unsettling than the constant pressure. Then on a Thursday morning, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't her. It was Ethan Blake, Natalie's ex. He looked thinner than I remembered, tired in a way that seemed baked into his bones. "I'm not here for drama," he said, "but I saw her a couple nights ago. She's staying in one of those pay-by-the-week motel out by the freeway." He hesitated, then added, "She told me she's pregnant." For a second, I just stared at him. Not because I thought she wouldn't lie, Natalie was capable of plenty, but because I didn't think she'd use that. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A basic clinic form. No letterhead, just pregnancy confirmed. 6 weeks. "I thought you should know," he said, and left without waiting for an answer. Jason came into the kitchen as I unfolded the paper. He didn't say anything, just stood beside me while I stared at it. And here's the truth. I didn't feel what I expected. Not guilt, not anger, relief. Because now I knew this wasn't just about tuition or housing or a scholarship. This was her entire life unraveling, and she wasn't calling me to manipulate anymore. She was spiraling quietly, completely. I folded the paper and slid it into the same drawer where I'd kept her last letter, the one where she'd written, "I know you don't owe me this, but I'm asking anyway." I didn't call my parents. I didn't tell anyone because for the first time in my life, it wasn't my job to fix, explain, or absorb. Let them find out on their own. Let someone else be the net. The drawer was almost full now. Letters, forms, proof, not of what she'd done, but of what I'd stopped doing. I closed it, feeling the quiet click of the latch in my fingertips. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the stable one. I just felt free,